Blog Talk Radio.
There are days when I'm reviewing the Meier material where it seems like there's just so much information here that there's just no way that I can ever adequately represent how much important information there is here. It's rather staggering in some ways. I want to talk about something that the Meier material calls the innermost creational nature. And somehow I read the book, The Might of Thoughts, 2 or 3 times before this really started to stick out and make itself clear. We have something called the innermost creational nature. And it's really our spiritual consciousness in some ways. There are impulses that come forth and radiate. They're called guiding impulses that come forth from this innermost creational nature. However, we have something called the innermost nature, or the self-created I, which I was thinking about today. How do you tell if you're being guided by the innermost creational nature, or you're being guided by your self-created I, your ego? And I started to notice that if I feel a need, whether it's, a need for food or a need for entertainment or what other need you have, I think a lot of times that's coming from the inner nature, the self-created nature. On the other hand, when I feel optimistic, confident, relaxed, cheerful, thankful, enthusiastic, that seems to be when I'm functioning mostly from this innermost creational nature. And that, again, is the neutral positive thinking. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is that it's real obvious at times when we're not in the neutral positive thinking mode because we're angry or we're frustrated or we have anxiety. But there are times that are a little more subtle where we're just as much functioning under the self-created I. It's very interesting because if you notice that your enthusiasm falls off or that you feel less motivated, I often think that that's a strong indication of the self-created I kind of dominating us at that particular moment. Again, the human being is able to distinguish the various impulses and the values of the innermost nature from the self-created personality. So that's part of the key, is trying to evaluate these impulses. Because, again, this is kind of a big jump conceptually, but the difference between the Plejaren, for example, and the Giza intelligences is that the Plejaren decided to live under the spiritual teachings, and they made strong effort to learn to evaluate their own thinking impulses enough to be able to determine, okay, are these impulses coming from the innermost creational nature, or are the impulses that I'm having coming from the self-created I? Now, the spirit form of the human being has this high, fine fluidal energy. It's talked about in Figure Bulletin 78. The spirit of the human being is more or less a high, fine fluidal energy source. And your spirit form is independent of your coarse material body and of your material consciousness. Your spirit form is immortal. And this fluidal force that comes forth as like a radiation from your spirit form, it's the oscillation in energy that comes from your thoughts and your feelings of your psyche as well. And it embeds itself in objects like your clothes and your furniture, your musical instruments, your books. If you have a book that you read a lot, then it's really filled with a lot of fine fluidal energy. Again, these energies are coming from your innermost creational nature, which is your spirit form. And if you allow yourself to be guided by your innermost creational nature, then you have the wisest leader that you could ever hope for inside you. So, and it also talks on page 390, it says, well, I'll read it to you. The human being thereby creates in himself or herself the wisest leader that she could ever wish for. And once the impulses of his or her innermost nature, that is to say, innermost creational personality, gradually becomes stronger and clearer. So these impulses, they become clearer and stronger over time, and we I guess we gain the ability to recognize these impulses clearer, because sometimes I don't think we can tell. I've been kind of analyzing myself throughout the day today and trying to discern if I'm functioning from my innermost creational personality or from the false ego or the self-created I. So what this book really is about, the Mind of the Thoughts book, is thoughts becoming reality. You have a thought, it becomes a wish, you nurture that thought, you develop a consciousness picture, you have an enthusiasm towards it, and eventually this will manifest itself in reality. And what's that line? It says, it is the nature of the thoughts that by their might alone, everything that can be conceived can be brought into fruition. On the other hand, this only occurs if you have a mental harmony. In other words, if you're in disharmony, what you have is the increasing of your suffering. So in order to bring about the circumstances that you want in life, you have to be confident, you have to be optimistic, you have to be cheerful, you have to be thankful, you have to be enthusiastic. Now, if you're not, then most likely you're functioning from your self-created I, and you're going to bring negative things into your life. You're going to bring suffering into your life. You're going to bring things that you don't want into your life. And then on top of that, we have this whole part of the mind, this unconscious part of the mind, that can affect our behavior and our emotions. And the unconscious mind works in a way that is many times not perceptible. So monitoring our thoughts, guiding our thoughts, avoiding self-created suffering. Many times we create our own suffering through our wrong thinking. So good thoughts lead to good feelings. Good feelings lead to good habits. Good habits lead to good circumstances in our lives. We are the master of our own destiny. And our destiny is fulfilled by the power of our thoughts, thoughts that are optimistic, thoughts that are confident, thoughts that are relaxed and cheerful, enthusiastic, and thankful. These are the kinds of thoughts that bring circumstances into our life that we want. The opposite of the proper neutral positive thinking are thoughts that are heavily laden with emotion, like anger and rage. But emotions are able to create thoughts. Emotions are spontaneous. They're hard to bring under control. Emotions arise so quickly that they're hard to, you cannot steer them. Emotions are like reflexes. And the unconscious subliminal perceptions are present within the human being. And sometimes unconscious thoughts are related to feelings that we have. The unconscious mind consists of those processes in the mind that are not immediately available to introspection. For example, you can have unconscious thoughts which leads to depressions or flattened feelings. Negative thinking can stabilize and deepen, and you have to really watch that, because a depression is a low mood, and these depressive thoughts can be imprinted on your mind, and they can create neural pathways. And when you are functioning outside of the creational nature, the creational innermost nature, we tend to start trying to deceive ourselves. It's quite interesting that these unconscious thoughts, they operate automatically, and they can throw our psyche into a turmoil. So what we're trying to do is the opposite of turmoil. The opposite of disharmony is harmony. And harmony is order in your thoughts. And your thoughts crystallize into the circumstances of your life. Something begins to crystallize when it becomes definite and clear. When something starts to crystallize, it is made free from confusion or ambiguity. So the destructive thoughts crystallize into negative circumstances. The healthy thoughts crystallize into positive circumstances. And sometimes it's a matter of perseverance. So asartang, as it's called, enslaves a person in a self-created imprisonment. That's imbalance. That's disharmony. Asartang means to get badly out of control of the good human nature. So again, and I'll switch back to the ancient past here, one of the topics I bounce into a lot is the Giza intelligences, because they were a powerful extraterrestrial people who were on the earth for thousands of years trying to control the people of the earth through religion. And they lived a life in a state of imbalance. They were very badly out of control of the good human nature. They demanded worship from the native earth peoples when they lived above the ground, and they tried to control the native earth peoples through religions when they were below the Great Pyramid. And they were on the earth until about 1979 or so. And they influenced people like Hitler through the Thule Society and back in time. According to Meier information, the person that the Bible, some versions of the Bible, refer to as Jehovah, was one of these Giza intelligences. So if you were to pull the most practical thing out of the Meier case, you would probably pull these spiritual teachings out of it. In the spiritual teachings, much of the spiritual teaching is either deals with the nature of creation, deals with reincarnation, and deals with the controlling of our thoughts. Constructive thoughts generate calmness, whereas destructive thoughts most likely generate a kind of turmoil in your psyche. Now, Billy Meier is a 80-year-old man. He lives in Switzerland, in a beautiful area, northern Switzerland. It's about 45 minutes east of Zurich by automobile. Near the pine forests and the beautiful mountains in northern Switzerland. He grew up in an area called Bulak, it's even a little farther north. And at a very young age, he started to get telepathic messages from an extraterrestrial man named Svath. Svath was about 1,000 years old. In 1945, February 3rd, Billy got a telepathic message to go out into the forest near his home in Bulak, Switzerland, and Svath's strange pear-shaped craft landed in a field nearby, and Billy came out of the forest, and Svath introduced himself, and Billy would later explain that he was pulled up into the craft as if by ghostly hands. One of the things that Svath told Billy is that in his previous lives, his spirit form had lived as the people that we today call Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, Muhammad. These prophets had different names during the time of their lives, all of them except Emmanuel and Muhammad. Emmanuel is the person that most people call Jesus. The letter J did not exist in the ancient world, did not come into existence roughly until about 1550, when a man named Gian Giorgio Torricino substituted the I's and the Y's in one of the documents he was working on with this new letter J, and it caught on there. In fact, the 1611 version of the Bible did not have the letter J in it, so the book of Job was the book of IOB, and James and John had much more complicated names that we can't even pronounce today. So the term Jesus is a term that's come lately. The Meier material states that the man's original name was Emmanuel, something which I kind of put into my mental hold basket for years because I never believed that the most important figure in Western society, we didn't even have his name right. Well, much to my shock, I found that to be the case, that the Meier information was correct again, because it was easy for me to go back with just a little bit of research and see that in Old English there wasn't even a letter J. So you can imagine, and the same is true for Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and all the ancient languages of the Bible. So, as strange as it may sound to you, the spirit form that is residing in this man in Switzerland is the same spirit form that existed in many of the biblical prophets who taught a very, very different teaching than what is taught today. They talked about the immortality of the spirit form of the human being. Everyone has within them a fine fluidal spiritual energy that comes and is created by the creation. It's immortal. It never dies. It never sleeps. It records everything that you do. And this spirit form will tell you if your thinking is right or wrong, if you've learned to pay attention to it. In the book, The Might of Thoughts, it's sometimes referred to as the innermost creational nature, because this spark of energy, this spiritual energy, has thoughts and feelings, and it sends and it radiates impulses, and it's your guiding light in your life. And like it said, like Semyase told Billy, it will tell you if your thinking is right or wrong if you've learned to pay attention to it. Well, young Edward Albert Meier back in 1945 was paying attention to his spirit form, which was giving him impulses. And one day he crawled out a lower window in his bedroom and looked up at a beautiful starry sky, and he started to recognize another kind of impulse, which was coming from what are called the storage banks. There are storage banks in our universe, in our galaxy, in our solar system, and in our planet. These are energetic archives of information, oscillations, waves of energy that are a source of knowledge. And young Billy's spirit form was very attuned to these energies. And he started saying profound things, and he was amazed at what he was feeling. And there's this wonderful writing that's called How It All Began. And if you haven't had a chance to read that, that's a wonderful writing, where Billy says things like he heard a voice in his head, probably the impulses of his own spirit form, that told him, my life is made out of the love of creation. So what is creation? It's this universal consciousness. It's a Wesenheiten, as it's called in the German. It's neither good nor evil. It's neutral. It's evolving. So it isn't this immutable God that's talked about in our religions. It's growing. It's advancing. It's the greatest source of energy and the greatest source of wisdom in our universe. But it is evolving. And it radiates love. The highest principle in creation is love. Highest principle in all creation is love, and everything exists through this principle in absolute logic. Every tiny plant and every tiny animal fulfills its purpose in love. And the laws of creation are so wonderfully arranged that everyone comes up against this radiating love. And if you close your senses to it, the universe will feel like a place without love. If you open yourself to it and you let this love flow in you, you will have a respectful gratitude and a great joy. But the human being often flips in and out of, for a while you're controlled by your innermost spiritual nature, your innermost creational nature, and then you'll be controlled by the false I. And it's a continual thing that we have to continually struggle with. The other thing that is the most difficult for the Earth human, as opposed to humans on other worlds, is that we have within the Earth human a genetic manipulation, which increases our aggression and shortens our lifespan. This was done to us by other human beings in the seer system. And these human beings were also descendants of the Lyrians, just as the Pleiadians are. So let me just step back a little bit and explain a little bit again about our universe. For those of you that may be listening to this for the first time, our universe is 46 trillion years old. It's roughly egg-shaped. It has within it 7 bands that counter-rotate against one another. So you can think of a circle within a circle within a circle within a circle until you have 7 circles, and they're counter-rotating one against the other. Well, in the 4th circle, or the 4th band, is where all the material is, the planets, the stars, the galaxies, the matter. The rest of the universe is immaterial. You want your mind to turn into a pretzel. Think about that for a while. The inner ring below the material belt is what's called space. And there are positive energies coming from space into the material belt. And outside the material belt is what's called the transformation belt. And there are negative energies coming from the transformation belt into the material belt. And these two, the negative and the positive energies, converge in the material belt and form another type of energy, which I haven't exactly heard defined in the Meier material. But this other kind of energy, that's the result of the negative and positive energies coming in from these other layers, forms the matter in our universe. And the matter in our universe can only last for about 45 billion years, and then it slowly fades back in the fine material. So that's a little bit of the nature of our universe. See, the universe is evolving according to a time schedule that's predetermined. So this universal intelligence, it's called a Wesenheiten, and it evolves according to this predetermined schedule. It expands after the Big Bang for 155 trillion years. And during that expansion phase, it creates spirit forms. Human beings have spirit forms. Animals have spirit forms. Plants have spirit forms. And in the center of your middle brain, you have a spirit form. It's the same spiritual energy that's the creation is made out of. It's immortal. It doesn't die. It generates your innermost creational self. It sends energy throughout your body. It entered into your body when you were just 21 days old as a child. And it brought the consciousness with it. So your spirit form lives many material lives, and each material life it lives with a new material consciousness, new unconscious, a new subconscious. Your subconscious is programmed with the essences of your wisdom from your previous lives. So you live many, many lifetimes in order to evolve your consciousness. Because eventually your spirit form, after all these lifetimes, merges back with this universal intelligence. And the universal intelligence gets to absorb all of your experiences, and it gets to see how you evolved. So my personal guess is that it creates human beings to observe their evolution, to learn about its own evolution. It creates spirit forms as a part of its own evolution. Billy's spirit form is very ancient. It's 9.6 billion years old. He's lived through all the 7 stages of human life. He is what's sometimes referred to as the universal prophet, meaning that he has incarnated on other worlds during the ancient past to do this job, this very, very difficult job that he's doing right now, which is to help speed up the evolution of the people on the earth. Not only has he been Enoch, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Emmanuel, and Muhammad, but he's been a whole slew of other very important people that we've heard of before, like Galileo and Mozart and Mendelssohn. He's also known as Nocodamian, and he lived as Nocodamian, who was the Pleiadians' teacher. And for them, it was quite a shock when they finally realized, and they only realized this a little bit, in the past couple of decades, that Billy had been their teacher in his previous lives. So they actually started to ask him to teach them, which he started to do. Now, Svath had some idea, some suspicion. Svath did say in the early contacts that he knew that this young boy he was teaching would eventually know much, much more than he did. Because some of the other lifetimes that Billy has lived, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Mendelssohn, Rasputin, Socrates, Aristotle. There were 4 Henochs. And he also lived as one of the Semyasas, although I don't know exactly which one. I don't know that that's ever been clarified. So, take that for what it's worth. I bet you that's very hard for a lot of people to digest. I just, to me, it, for some reason, doesn't. One of the principles in Billy's book called The Way to Live is called fulfillment of your duty to yourself. So he talks about care for the health of your body, care for the health of your consciousness. You need to challenge your body. You need to exercise your body. You need to challenge your consciousness. And he says something very, very profound here. Whoever devotes him or herself to the passion and incessantly sets the sails of his or her lusts, vices, and addiction finally runs through the smoldering desert, dying of thirst. Boy, I think every Earth human needs to read this and understand it. I think particularly on Earth, we follow our vices, our addictions, our lusts. That's one of our biggest problems. He says, therefore, never do hidden things about which you would have to feel ashamed before yourself or in the eyes of a stranger. should such a one see a reprehensible deed. So never do hidden things that if a stranger saw you do, you would feel ashamed about. He also says that your clothes speak about who you are. So not to let yourself appear ragged. He also says never lose confidence in yourself. Very interesting book. It says boredom is the death of all initiatives. Whoever falls prey to boredom falls prey to addictions and vices and goes astray. Therefore, every human being should always be a good and pleasant companion to himself or herself. And you should be able to entertain yourself to your own satisfaction. And idleness, when you're idle, only do it as a time to relax. You know, one of the big principles in the Meier teaching is the principle related to striving. And this is something I do talk about a lot on the show, but I've been I could be more focused about the principle of striving. Hi, Eve. Good to see you. I should say Evelyn. I should say Eve, but I always pronounce her name wrong. I don't know why I do that. But let me, I'm going to play just a second of nature sounds, and I'm going to pull my book out on the way to live, and we'll talk a little bit more about striving. Before I dive into striving, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Giza intelligences again. Billy saw them the first time when his second spiritual mentor, his second extraterrestrial mentor, Asket, took him below the Giza plateau. They went far underground. They eventually were able to travel far enough below the Giza plateau, far enough underground, where they went through this gateway. It was like a giant stone she called an ashlar. It dissolved, and Billy and Asket went through, and it became a stone again behind them. Up to that point, they had both put on a kind of device that made them invisible. So there was a gigantic hallway here that Billy had seen, and a 300-meter disc that was massive and smaller ships beside it. And he saw strangely dressed guards, and the light was very unusual. The ceiling was incredibly high, and he was astonished. He was looking at this spacecraft that was underground and below this great pyramid. And Asket kind of pulled him over to another plateau there where he saw a Y-shaped cross, a crown of thorns that had this kind of brownish blood on it, 3 or 4 nails that had brownish kind of blood on them. He saw a staff about 3 meters long, a purple cape, and a leather pouch that had some precious stones in it. And he was struggling with this because he was raised fairly Christian, and he wasn't, it just didn't make sense what he was seeing here, extraterrestrials and the cross of Christ, and what could this all be? And Asket took him back to the surface and started for the next 2 days, told him and explained to him what all this was, and that these extraterrestrials were a splinter group from the Pleiadian. They weren't following the spiritual teachings. They were living according to their own lusts and addictions, and they were not paying attention to the impulses of their spirit forms. They weren't paying attention to this innermost I that we're talking about. So all of their striving, was off base. And that's where I was heading for, is your striving is so critical to your happiness. It really comes down to you, whether you want to be happy or not, because happiness requires arduous amounts of work. So if you're going to work for something or work towards something, try to make sure that it's not something that's against the spiritual teachings or against the creational natural laws. But know this, that striving is related to your happiness. And sometimes you just have to put your head down and strive on. And if you don't, you will experience a period of boredom or unhappiness. Let me read what it says here on page 102. Striving means delectation. Delectation means satisfaction. It's good. Maybe not the best definition, pretty close. Striving means delectation in a form which is always fulfilling and progresses. To be without striving means unwillingness and affliction. So if you're going through a very, very difficult time in your life, I always tell people, myself, mostly myself, get to work. If it means cleaning up your garage, do that. If it means cleaning up your car, do that. If it means working in the garden, do that. If it means working at your day job, do that. If it means studying the Meier material, do that. If it means working on a hobby, focus on that. But affliction is inhibited striving and inhibited life. Addicts are a person that's only living. I think if there was one thing you could say that the Meier material has also changed my day-to-day life very, very much, is that it has made me an even busier person. And from what I understand, if you go out to Switzerland, they're all that way because they're oriented to striving this way. But inhibited striving and inhibited life bring inhibited evolution and stagnation, hopelessness, grief, confusion, irrationality, joylessness, cognitionless, unpeace, disharmony, lovelessness, resentment, lies, self-deceit, and reluctance for life. So there are times when you're tired. It's like, I don't want to work right now. And there are times when you just should take a nap, meditate, go to sleep. But it's one of the realities of life. I live basically in a state park. There's trees everywhere, and I'm very fortunate in that sense. I feel very blessed. This week, as I was waking up in the morning, and for some reason lately I've been very tired in the mornings, don't know why, but I see this little hummingbird. The sun's just come up, and this little guy is out there flying around. And it's like, man, he's up, and he's already working. He's already striving. It's part of nature. And then I remember, in the evenings, I've seen him out there flying around as well, striving away, in the evenings. This little guy is working all the time. And it's a part of survival. Therefore, delectation, harming, happiness, as well as everything positive, as well as grief and everything negative, are in the end only the revelation of how pronounced the striving is in any life form. So it's kind of, the rule is this: if you want to be happy, you're going to have to do a lot of work. And isn't that ironic? You think to be happy, you're going to lay around and drink pina coladas all day and watch videos or something like that, but that's not the case. Depending on the degree of the strength of the striving of any single reason, it will assert itself in the world and prevail, or it will fall, shatter, waste away, come to an end and vanish. And striving doesn't end with death, because when you go into the energy band around the planet, when your consciousness is taken over there, and your spirit form is processing all your activities in your previous life, and when everything that you've learned is being distilled into its essences, and your new personality is being created, and the subconscious is being programmed with the essences of your wisdom, all of that striving is going on the death side. As a human being may seem, because striving is also included in death. The human being strives for the life and for the death at the same time, because the Grim Reaper accompanies the human being to a new life and to new striving. The death is an interlude between the two lives in the realm of the other world, in which striving finds its progress and keeps life alive. As obvious as this, however, for every single human being who has understood the truth of this law, it is indeed doubtless thus that in the physical life, the striving can be inhibited in all directions at any moment. Now, and something? I think this is, the Meier material calls the universal consciousness a Wesenheiten. I don't think it ever stops striving. Not until the expansion phase is over, the contraction phase is over, and then it goes into its sleep phase. So the creation is a juggernaut. It is continually striving, 24/7, 155 trillion years during its expansion phase. We can slow down and take it easy on our evolution for a while and ease back a little bit. Because we're Visan, we have personalities, we can do that. The creation doesn't do that. It's like a locomotive. It just keeps going. Nothing stops that evolution. The striving can be inhibited in all directions at any moment if you're a human being, exactly according to how the morality and the disposition play out in the human being, or which outside influence and disturb the human being in his thinking and acting, and thereby also in his striving. As a neutral positive, the universal consciousness, nothing disturbs its neutral positive thoughts. So it's continually striving all the time. Thus it can even be that where the striving appears to be fulfilled, it turns against itself as a consequence of tribulations, whereby it threatens to suffer a shipwreck. It's ironic. We've been talking about, I talked with Daniel a couple shows ago about the song, the Edmund Fitzgerald, The Shipwreck in Lake Superior. This ship was the pride of the American side. It was the biggest freighter, I think, that was ever built at that time. And it broke in two during this tremendous storm in Lake Superior. And all these men were killed. And Gordon Lightfoot sings this profound and beautiful song about it. And it reminds me of the neutrality of creation. Even though it radiates love, it's very neutral. So these guys suffered a shipwreck and they died there. The creation is not a heavenly Father in that sense. The laws of cause and effect continue to roll forward. But such happenings can be countered in a positive form when the human being strengthens him or herself the truth of the creational truth and love through the fulfilling of the creational laws and recommendations through wisdom collected from true practical experience. Therefore, it is the case that the human being can learn from the unending truths and the wisdoms of creation and can adapt and integrate himself or herself into the following of its laws and recommendations, and thereby become so knowing that the immense recognition and practical experience and therefore wisdom enter him or her, whereby he or she becomes the master of himself or herself, with his or her own power of decision and power of determination, and the absolute capacity to act as the master of himself or herself. So that's one of the goals we're shooting for here, is to be masters of ourselves. And to start to learn to set these zeals, these culmination points. So striving, you kind of have to put your head down sometimes, because there are some difficult periods associated with striving where you just got to keep pushing forward, because you're going to be expending a lot of effort. There's going to be a lot of hard work. And sometimes your goals are not dropped right into your lap. You've got to really go again and again and again to go heads down on the striving and continue to work, because circumstances will actually come up which go against the striving. There are powers in nature that work against your striving. But this is part of the creational natural laws. So there's an opposite pole which is working against your striving. One of the things I like to do is it helps me stay neutral, is not to spend too much time on a given task, and because if you're working really, really hard on it, you'll tend to lose your neutrality. You'll get tired, you'll get frustrated. So you take these reoccurring breaks fairly often in order to maintain your neutral outlook, in order to keep the harmony in your soul. Because if you're working so hard, you can become sartung, which is to become badly out of control of the good human nature. To be neutral, in other words, when you're working on a task, sometimes you're working for the sake of working, if I can say that much, in that you're enjoying the process. You're relaxed, and you're enjoying the process, and you're not so much in a hurry to get to the end point, to get your work done. I mean, ultimately that's your goal, but you need to be able to enjoy this process, and this helps you maintain your neutral, positive point of view, because it isn't just about finishing the task, because once the task is done, you got to try to figure out the next task. So there must always be these two poles, a plus and a minus, a pro and a con, a negative and a positive. And together these two poles always produce a oneness and equalizedness. And this is part of the creational natural laws. You cannot push the negative out of your life. There's always a pole there, a negative, that's helping you with your striving. With any striving are negative influences and machinations of an evil form, which are inseparable with one another. just like fire and heat. So just keep that in mind as you're striving. You're going to have opposition to your striving, and it's a part of the natural laws. Part of the great burden, I think, and you kind of learn after a while just to accept it. If you're going to take on the spiritual teachings, it's the easier way, by the way. If you live according to your addictions and to your whims, you'll that's where carnage comes from. And it's very strange if you look at these Giza intelligences, the way the sons would kill the fathers. Horrible. And just a dog eat dog. Even though these people had greater technology than us, what a disgrace to achieve a high technology and to treat your family and friends in such a horrible way. And that's what happens when we are not guided by the impulses of our innermost nature. And this is really, we're on the verge. We could very much become a society like that. In many ways, we are a society like that. But there is a small group that are learning the way to live, that are learning the might of the thoughts, that are learning that when you have negative thoughts, when you soon will allow yourself to be controlled by them. But whatever you think, you make real. And that which the human being thinks about, he becomes. It is the nature of the thoughts that by their might alone, every conceivable thing can be brought into fruition. So you are the master of your own destiny. You have the power to create good circumstances in your life. And I hope you all have a great evening. Thanks for listening. I'm so glad so many people are enjoying the archives. We'll talk to you very soon. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.